We kind of quickly picked up on the concept that Daniel's chapter 10, 11, and 12, realistically, are all the same chapter. Daniel chapter 10 was kind of what was happening before the vision and what happened to Daniel physically and spiritually when he received the vision. He heard the vision, and he had kind of that spiritual face plant, and he was laying in the ground. And we see him being ministered to, which is always kind of the awesome concept, because we are. I mean, how many times are we going to be at that, not just a physical face plant, but a spiritual one? The work that God has for us sometimes can lay us out. But we see him ministering to Daniel, lifting Daniel back up. In Daniel chapter 11 and 12, we're going to see that vision explained, that prophecy explained, what Daniel heard explained. And then in chapter 12, which we won't be getting into this week, we're going to have the instructions for what to do with that vision and that prophecy. Let's pray together. Lord Jesus, thank you so much for the amazing day that you've given to us, God, to grow closer to you, to grow closer to one another, Lord, and to grow through your word, by your Spirit, by your word, God. Thank you so much for the power that those things have had in our lives. And just pray, Lord, for wisdom and discernment, God. Especially as we're seeing the spirit of this text compared to the current spirit of the world in relation, God, to things you have called us into. And we pray in your name. Amen. So, last week we did cover 11 verse 1, so we'll be picking up in verse 2 of chapter 11. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these. Chapter 11, as we promised last week, is a rough chapter. Not because it's hard to understand, but because it's a lot. We're going to be covering roughly 130 years-ish of history, which is going to be interesting how this portion of history kind of compares to where we are now. As we discussed the concept of prophecy and those essentially the viewpoints of prophecy as we're opening the book of Daniel, there's really 2 ways to look at prophecy. There's the point and shoot, the Greek thought towards prophecy. You see or hear the prophecy, and then you look for the fulfillment. What's interesting, especially where we are now, anybody that's been paying attention to the news in the last week, we see kind of that cycle of prophecy, the Jewish mindset towards prophecy. We've seen it before, we've seen the fulfillment, and it's just going to keep on going. And we're going to see essentially what happened about 2,500 years ago, and we're kind of still seeing that wheel work in motion now. So picking up in verse 2, and now I will tell you the truth. I really like that word, truth. And it brings me to one of my favorite questions. Whenever there's a question in the Bible, especially any question involving God, involving Jesus, you really have to chew that one over. One of my favorite questions in the Bible is when Jesus was with Pilate. And Pilate asked him, what is truth? Kind of a powerful question, really, when you think about it. Just let that kind of resonate in you. What is truth? And we see Daniel discussing this concept of truth with, as we talked about last week, probably an angel. And it leads us to, what is it that he's talking about? He's going to tell him truth. Truth of what? He's giving Daniel truth of what's coming. How important is that? What kind of truth are we listening to what's coming? We have a hard time chewing up the truth that's been in front of us for the last 3 months. What is truth? What works? What doesn't work? What parameters should we be maintaining? Should it be a 6-foot distance? What is it? And every time we see this form of truth come out, we see something new completely surpass it. Now, how much more confusing the truth of what's happening in the end times? How many of us have a solid understanding of what's going to happen in the days to come? We talked about Daniel's 77s. How many people's heads hurt after that concept of 77? Not just a biblical concept. How many people's heads hurt as I was trying to do the math for you? Horrible, wasn't it? That's why I'm not a mathematician. He's going to discuss truth, and it really brings something home for us, something interesting. First, do we listen to truth? Not just hear it, but actually listen to truth. Typically, we brush it off altogether because a lot of times we don't want truth. I don't. Every morning. Probably because I was a Marine. Or maybe it's because of the lack of money I had when I was younger, but I'm going back to the Marine thing. They dressed me when I was forever. You're going to wear the exact same thing you wore yesterday, tomorrow, and 10 years from now. That's how the military works. If you're running, you're going to wear a different uniform, but it's going to match what everybody else is wearing. Every morning. Just about. I asked my wife, babe, how does this look? So she tells me with the truth. Yeah, it looks good. I'll wear something completely different. So then I look like my son. Rain boots, basketball shorts, and a button-up shirt with a nice jacket. Something weird. We have a hard time listening to the truth because it hurts our sensibilities. Point 2, do we seek truth? Generally, we only seek truth to develop an answer, to get an answer that we want, for essentially the same reasons we seek justice. Ignoring our own injustices that we have caused, but we want that truth all of a sudden. When we're truly seeking a truth, typically it has something pointing at us that we would rather not. And we're going to see Daniel not just listening to truth, but we have seen Daniel seeking truth. And a truth that he is going to lay out is essentially the end times truth, but also a hard times truth. And that's one that we as believers, that we have as a body, as a whole, not just here in little old Calvary Chapel, Baker City, but overall, what truth do we seek in hard times? We want to hear it's not going to be hard at all. Because we're Christians, it's going to be super easy. It'll be just roller skating down, it's going to be nothing. That's not the answer that Daniel is going to receive. And how important it is for us right now to actually seek and pursue truth. Yesterday, before my neighbor, scared what little hair left I had on my head, I took a pause from studying, and I started just to flip through YouTube at what the media calls truth right now. Went through news clips, which we already know that was fairly dodgy. Just went through TV shows. A lot of things what I found is anymore, Lucifer is the good guy or the anti-hero of the story, and God is the bad guy. One of the things that I watched last night was God having a sit-down with Lucifer so he could apologize to Lucifer for casting him off, so that God could use Lucifer's help to fight the battles that are coming. My word, how backwards is that? That is what's being preached. And the sad thing is who's doing most of the preaching? It's not us. I'm not looking for a number to be shouted or anything else, but when was the last time we had shared our faith? When was the last time we had shared our testimony? Not your testimony to a body of believers, which is awesome, and there's certainly a place for it, and it's powerful, and it helps grow. But when's the last time you've shared your faith with someone who doesn't have any, who especially is having a hard time with things? Who talks more, us or the television? It's unfortunate, but I think we already kind of have a solid handle on that particular portion of truth. What is truth? And one of my favorite words in the Bible is the word right after truth. Behold, to gaze at intently. So as we are seeking it, as we are listening to it, we need to come to that place of studying it. To gaze at it intently, with all thought, with all heart. Every time I see that word behold, my mind, my heart always goes to the same place, when Jesus steps into the Jordan to be baptized. And we read what John the Baptist says. It says, behold the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world. So you compare that word with any of these other behold in the Bible, it really kind of brings a whole different light to it, doesn't it? Really behold what the truth is of even the hard stuff we're getting ready to read. Anybody in the room a huge fan of Leviticus? Yeah, one, Megan, always. Always my wife. That's where we're going. A little bit of hardness. Okay, so now he is essentially launching into, for Daniel, some prophecy. For us, this part is history, which is what makes it a little bit, whatever the word you want to stick in there for, but this is something that Daniel is still trying to wrap his mind around. So he says, 3 more kings will arise in Persia. So we're going to deal with 2 kingdoms here. We're going to deal with Persia, and we're going to deal specifically with Greece. So he says 3 more kings are going to rise in Persia. Those 3 kings probably being Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, Pseudo-Smyrnus, Darius I, and Xerxes. Xerxes being that real strong king, that one that was kind of making trouble against Greece. So that 4th will be Richard, dealing with Xerxes. Then them all, by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Pretty much the universal, unanimous decision on that one is we're dealing with Alexander the Great, the same figure that we have been focusing on. So he's mentioned briefly, when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these. And about the next 19 verses, we're dealing with wars between the kings of the north and the south. So first we're going to see that picture of prophecy then as it still unfolds now. What we're going to be dealing with is about, like I said, 130 years of war. And Jesus let us know in the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, 25, and Luke chapter 21, that those precursors, those things leading up to the end, we have wars and rumors of wars. These are going to be birth pangs, and they're going to get worse. We're going to see that as it takes place through this text. We're also really dealing with 2 nations. We're going to deal with Persia. We're kind of skipping the reign of Alexander a little bit, as it's more of a footnote here, and going into that divided kingdom of Greece. We talked about when Alexander died, his kingdom was broken up into 4 groups. It was given to his generals. He didn't have any heirs at this point to give it to. So he said, give my kingdom, give my empire to the strong. It was broken up into 4 generals. Lysimachus, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Seleucus. But we still find ourselves only focusing on Persian and Grecian empires. And even the Grecian empires, we're only focusing on 2, the kings of the north and the south. Why is that? You have to remember, when we went through Daniel chapter 2, we saw Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We saw that great big colossus that was multicolored, had the different metals, the head of gold, chest and arms of silver. Then we went into the abdomen, upper leg area of bronze, and then the legs of iron, and then the feet, the kingdom that we're still waiting for, a mixture between clay and iron. We're focusing on the nations that not just had that dominion or that ruling authority over Israel, but we're also looking for the ones that had that heavy negative impact on Israel. The kings of the other 2 nations, so the west and the east, not so much of an impact as the other 2. Persians had their large persecution of Israel through Haman. Remember that story through the book of Esther. He had that law that went out to where they were going to exterminate the Jews. And in the 2nd century, we see the same thing with Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, the Greek, persecuting the Jews. Alexander the Great, while he is the one that did conquer Israel, he never actually went in and sacked Israel, which we also talked about as we opened up the book of Daniel. So he's letting Daniel know the direction that this particular dream, or these words, this vision, is going. So verse 5, now on to the fun stuff. Also, the king of the south, which is Ptolemy, he is in Egypt, so Ptolemy the first. We're not going to go into all of this crazy context with who's ruling who and what nation at what time and who married who, because you'd all be snoozing. Erdman's Bible Handbook, does very well breaking this down. William MacDonald does a pretty good job breaking it down. Encyclopedia does a great job breaking it down if you want to go into and look at the dynamics of it. It is something that I would encourage you to do, something I would encourage you to pursue studying, because this chapter, chapter 11, the first, I think, 35 verses of it, are so detailed in their prophecies. That's one of the reasons that everybody fights it. That's one of the biggest reasons that people say, well, it wasn't written by Daniel in the 6th century. Maybe the first couple of chapters written by Daniel, but everything else was written much later on, because they're that detailed. Daniel would have had information about Persia. Daniel was still in, not power, but he was still essentially working for the government during the reign of Persia, during Cyrus and Darius. So he had seen the inner workings of that one. But Daniel's long since dead when Greece starts becoming a player. And as we're discussing the next few verses, we're talking about how the kings of the north and the south are going to be fighting with one another for over 100 years. So it's kind of crazy when you think about that concept. Also, why is Daniel receiving visions over a king of the north and a king of the south, of completely opposite areas of the battle space, if you will? Because anytime you want to attack somebody that's up north, or anytime someone up north wants to attack somebody to the south, who's the poor chap stuck in the middle? It's Israel. They were always this stomping ground. So that's where we're going. Also, the king of the south, Ptolemy, became strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And at the end of some years, they shall join forces. For the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of her authority. And neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. Talking about the daughter whose name is Berenice. As we're going through this section, what's interesting, especially the direction that we're going right now with the spirit of the times that we're in right now, the decay of nations. I like that they give us a little heading in our Bibles. I think most of them probably say the War of the Kings of the North and South, or the Warring Kings, or whatever the case may be. What we're really looking at is the decay of nations. Each one wanted a 1,000-year reign. Even Hitler wanted a 1,000-year reign, a 1,000-year Reich. When you look at all of these nations, what kind of a start have they got? Typically a great one. We're looking at the history of Babylon, looking at the history of the Mesopotamian Empire, the Grecian Empire, the beginnings of the Roman Empire. We see all of these amazing starts, even the start in America. Typically when we say, well, how was America founded? One of my favorite answers as of late was guns and faith. I was like, okay, well, gotcha. Where are we at now? You can see the longer as it goes on, certain things and certain worldly truths that sneak into it, we start seeing a decay in our own homes. And what are some of those things that lead to decay? Well, we see Alexander the Great conquer the entire known world while he was still at a very young age. People argue anywhere from 28 to 32 years old, and he started about the time he was 17, 18 years old, so pretty quick. Very fast, which is why he had the animal assigned to him that he did in the dream that we covered a few weeks ago. Once he died and broke up his kingdom, what did the rest of the conquest look like? They kind of quit going outward so much, and they started kind of going inward more. Started attacking one another. One of the pieces of decay, or what led to it that we see here, is the arranged marriage that we see with Berenice, that daughter. We're kind of called not to be unequally yoked for a reason. And if you're trying to make peace through a marriage, which we've seen on a number of occasions in history, historically here, when she dies, it looked dodgy, and it started an even more fierce of a war. We see them essentially giving away their strength. Verse 7, but from a branch of her roots, one shall arise in his place. who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. Talking about Ptolemy III. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt, with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. So we see the concept of war continuing, trying to take more, trying to gather more. Verse 8 is kind of an interesting one, as we see them essentially stripping everything out that matters. And there's typically three schools of thought on verse 8. He says, he shall also carry out their gods captive to Egypt with their princes and precious articles of silver and gold. That concept of gods has people kind of twisted around because of the word that's used for gods. It's Elohim, a word that we are very familiar with, showing not just the singularity of God, but also the plurality. It's a word we've used to kind of discuss and to seek out the Trinity. So what does that word mean? Three schools of thought. First, it's the magistrates. Just like we've seen earlier in the book of Daniel, along with princes or governors, they're stripping out the leadership from the land. That makes sense. Anytime they're conquering, we saw Nebuchadnezzar do it. We see Cyrus or Darius trying to essentially going through that sorting process. So he's removing the leadership. Instead of letting everybody fend for themselves or think for themselves, they're imposing their own way of life on that conquered nation. Even the Vikings had their own similar concept, never leave behind a man, woman, or child who could later on carry a sword. We see Nebuchadnezzar doing that one in Daniel chapter 1, giving them the Babylonian mindset, so it's an enemy they don't have to fight later. Point makes sense to me. The second school of thought on that one is they're removing all of the idols from the temples. Also a possibility. We remember the story in Genesis with Rachel taking the teraphim as Jacob and them were starting to flee. So she took the teraphim, the little tiny idols that her father had, Laban, and she stashed them. It's that sign of blessing, sign of wealth, sign of posterity for the family, something that the father would glorify in. Also, certainly a possibility. The third form or school of thought is they actually took gods from Egypt and carried them off. Not my favorite school of thought, because it just kind of seems foolish. If it's a god that can be carried off with somebody, it's probably not a god worth serving. Essentially looking at like a microwave. So we see them completely emptying out the land, trying to reduce them to far less. Also, the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. However, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through, and he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. And the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude. But the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will be cast down, tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. Talking about that battle of Raphia. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times shall rise up against the king of the south also violent men of your people. Who is your people? The Jews. Remember, he's talking to Daniel. So your people would be the Jews. Now we can kind of start to see where this is going a little bit. Shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. But he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. What are we noticing from these last 10 verses? All they're doing is fighting back and forth. What's the main focus of the flesh? Really two things that I can see from the text. First is pride. He hit me first, so now I'm going to hit him back. Anybody with kids, even as adults, he started it. I'm 36, and I generally, not talking to Megan or Cassie, I generally like to think of myself as fairly mature. But I still pop up, I still come out with, he started it. Really mature. But pride, man, what that reduces us to. How many lives being lost? Something incredible. In their pride, not only who has the most, but just like we saw with Nebuchadnezzar, with Darius, worried about the legacy. What legacy have they left? We've already moved beyond Ptolemy the First. I know we just covered a lot of verses, but we're making our way through 130 years. We've moved beyond even Antiochus the First down to Antiochus the Third. So all these generations, what was the legacy they left? One of nothing but blood. Those two aspirations is what we see in the text for the flesh, for men. And it's important to note here, as we discussed last week in chapter 10, we all serve something. We see people trying to take that neutral ground. Well, I'm agnostic. I'm sure there's something out there, but I'm not really dedicating myself to anything because who knows what it is you're dedicating yourself to. Even in that stance, a side has been chosen. There's two sides. And we see the flesh serving the flesh here in the aspirations of their pride, their legacies, their kingdoms, and the material riches they're heaping up for themselves. My friends, that is the worst legacy that we can leave behind. And it's a really hard one. In my youth, when I was a kid, we grew up in a trailer park. We had not much money. I had 3 brothers. There's a lot of us. All boys, all hard to handle, as some of us were or are going through now. Didn't have a lot. We spent all of our time kind of looking over the fence. So when I got older, and I joined the Marine Corps, at least what I assumed at the time, was I was making a lot of money. Well, I guess it's a lot of money if you don't have any. But Megan and I, in our 20s, started discussing the concept of having kids. And one of the first things that crossed my mind is I'm going to give my kids every single thing that I did not have when I was a kid. That's not good in the end. It's great in thought. I didn't have the fanciest toys. We didn't have the fanciest vehicles. My first vehicle was a 77 Volkswagen Rabbit that I helped my father rebuild, and I traded it because it wasn't manly enough. I traded it for a 1968 Ford F-100. All the rings and the pistons were worn. Any of us that are mechanically inclined knows what that means. Looks like you're driving a diesel. So anytime my dad would get in the truck with me, he'd go like this at people because he was pretending he was riding in a semi. But we start focusing on the wrong aspect of our legacy. I'm going to give everything my kids didn't have. I'm going to give them the TVs, the video games, better vehicles, better clothes, better toys, better education, better you name it. And it took me a long time to realize that I was kind of leaving out the best part of the legacy that even my mother passed down to me. We weren't churchgoers, as we discussed with some of you this morning. We'd go here and there. We ended up with the LDS for a while and how all that played out. But what really kept me on track was my mother would read almost every night this dodgy, 60-book series that a traveling salesman, I don't really do it anymore, I don't think, but he was selling these Bible story books for kids, and the series was massive. She'd read us those. Even something so simple, that little piece ended up keeping us on track. As Gina had mentioned this morning, even kids, while it's not always optimal to be joining us in the larger settings, some of the stuff that they're able to just absorb can be uncanny. Just some of the stuff they can learn. What is the legacy that we have passed down? I'm not saying you need to be uber concerned about your legacy, because we've seen how that worked out for the other ruling kings. But it is important to try and come to grips with what it is that you are leaving. Where did I leave off? We're just going to go to verse 16. But he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land, destruction and power. I did already read that one. So we're talking about the glorious land being Israel. So the fleshly point, the fleshly desire as to what is going on here, is they're looking for, their legacy. They're fixing wounded pride. They're looking for riches. And we see a fantastic story through that one, through Josephus, as far as what happened to the temple in AD 70. Just looking to strip out those riches. But we're also not seeing the spiritual aspects. We see the fleshly mission. We see the spiritual mission, the glorious land. Extermination of the Jews, which is why we have such fierce promises in the teachings of the Olivet Discourse. Those promises going to the Jewish people. They're always afraid they are going to be wiped out. The enemy is looking to stamp them out before the Messiah is born, which we'll get into in Revelation chapter 12 once we make our way to Revelation. After the Messiah is born, we still see such a fierce persecution of the Jewish people. We're going to see him lashing out in anger. We saw in Daniel chapter 10 that heavy spiritual aspect to it. There was a prince in Persia that withstood an angel that required the help of Michael. So we're not talking about just a regular Persian king. We've seen through the scriptures angels just decimating, not just dudes, but entire cities, like it was nothing. But we see this prince of Persia being risen up to stop that angel from taking the message to Daniel. And that same messenger is letting us know there's going to be another coming with the kingdom of Greece. And we see the glorious land caught in the middle. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus he shall do, and he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it. But she shall not stand with him or be with him. Talking about Cleopatra. Not the Cleopatra. This is about 100 years before the famous Cleopatra steps on scene. After this, he shall turn his face to the coastlands, and shall take many. But a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. So while we're still seeing essentially all these broken apart Grecian nations fighting one another, verse 18 brings in something new. Lucius Cornelius Scipio, a Roman general. Who's the next occupying force? It's going to be Rome. The legs of iron. The next kingdom that's going to rule all of that known territory is going to be Rome. We're going to see in the next few verses, well, we're not going to see it in the verses, but in history, we see Antiochus even ending up after a failed attempt to go into Egypt. We see the ruler, the king of the south, paying Rome to help him fight these battles. He's paying the next schoolyard bully to step up and be a bully. He's basically paying somebody to beat him up later. You want to start seeing a decay in the nations? You want to start seeing a decay in the morality of your nations? You want to start seeing a decay in your walk with Christ? Start paying homage to the enemy and watch how fast you crumble. And the sad part about it is, as it talks, I don't remember which of the minor prophets it is, I'm sorry, so I guess you just have to go and find it for yourself. Acts 17:11, right? We start paying homage to an enemy, and it starts sapping away our strength, and we don't even know it. And that might seem kind of dumb, because that section with the minor prophets is, you look in the mirror, and you can't even tell that your hair has turned gray. That's more like I don't want to see it. That's why I shave my hair. We saw it with Samson in the book of Judges. Every morning that his wife, lovely, I think it was Delilah, all the Philistines are coming. He'd hop up and he'd throw him a beating. One day he hopped up to throw him a beating, and completely unaware that his whole relationship with God had been severed. His strength had been taken away from him. He didn't get up and be like, oh my goodness, my arms feel like noodles. and he ran out the back door. He got up to go and fight those guys, and it didn't work out well for him. And we can see that in our own physical lives. I'm 36. I like to feel invincible. We got the inspection back on our house in Homedale. One of the things on the inspection was we need to run a duct from your bath fan so it runs outside. Okay, I could do that. I climbed up my attic. I've leapt walls, climbed over trucks. I've ran 10-mile obstacle races. The things that I've done with my body in the course of my adult life, to me, have been incredible. The things I've been able to do without breaking too many bones. I climbed up into an attic. I made it 2 feet because the 2x4s hurt my knees. It's like, I am too fat for this. All my weight is on my knees on these stupid 2x4s. This is horrible. So I climbed back down. And now when I get home tonight, my neighbor's going to help me. But I really thought that I could do it. So I climbed up there. I was like, man, this hurts. That hurts. This is tired. And this isn't even working. We don't realize as we continue on the course that we are losing our strength. A lot of us, if I knew then what I knew now, right? What causes the sapping of my strength? Not even talking about military injuries, which apparently are just multiplying. But what leads to those injuries? For me, one too many visits to the taco truck. I would love that piece of cake. I've been on a diet for 2 weeks. 2 nights ago, I come home, and Megan, as a gift and a blessing for the children and for the family that have taken care of my kids the next couple of days so we can pack to move here, she baked so many cookies. So what did I do? I wouldn't stop. Wolfing down cookies. Horrible idea. That saps away essentially your strength. Where we decide to feed that monster that's going to come back and bite us later. And we see them doing the exact same thing. You want to see that decay of nations? We start making those compromises. That's going to lead to something far worse later. Verse 20. This is where it starts getting fun. There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom. Makes sense. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Who does that sound like? Now we start getting at that foreshadowing, that type of the Antichrist. Historically, we're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus the Fourth. When he's talking about him as a vile person, it's not talking about his character. It's talking about how he took the throne. He wasn't supposed to have the throne. Which is why they would not give him the honor of royalty. He's going to seize he's going to come in peaceably. He's going to seize the kingdom by intrigue, essentially through deceit, a deceitful covenant. We're going to see the exact same thing in the book of Revelation. We also see it in Thessalonians, in the Olivet Discourse. We see all of these things. We saw in, I think, Daniel chapter 9, how the Antichrist is going to be coming into power. He's going to be coming in under the guile of truth, which is why it's so important for us to know truth. But it goes back to, are we seeking, or are we listening, are we even trying to hear truth? The decay, even in the churches, is uncanny. How many churches are just biblically illiterate? How many times have we, or we've seen, come to churches without our Bibles, without a notepad? If we're reading our Bibles and not answering questions, are we actually seeking? Or are we more hearers and strictly hearers? He's going to come in through false pretenses and seize the throne and make things worse for everybody else. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant, which we talked about last week one of Epiphanes' moves is he removed the current high priest, a position for life. It's not the first time we saw a Gentile nation do it. We also see it in Jesus' times, while there's technically two high priests there. He's going to remove someone who's not very happy about Greek concepts or religions. He's going to remove that high priest and put someone else in there that's a little bit more agreeable. And we see how that little move is going to line up with everything else. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. We also saw in verse 9, there's going to be that peaceful coming in, that deceitful covenant, but halfway through the covenant, that 7-year covenant, he's going to break it. We already start to see that foreshadowing. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province. And he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. We see Rome helping in the defeat of Antiochus IV. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy his army. He shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the time will still be at the appointed time. Kind of an interesting thing. Even the plans of men trying to subvert as much as humanly possible, it's not stopping the appointed time. Just like we talked about the angel trying to get the message to Daniel. While he was withstood, he didn't falter, he didn't fail. The message still went out. We see these men trying to come to the table peaceably, and yet they're speaking lies. Neither of them aware of the truth. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For the ships of Cyprus, Rome, shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant, and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Moving into those abominations and those persecutions of Antiochus IV. He tries to make his move against Egypt, and he becomes defeated. He loses. What is now hurting with that king? His pride. He's going to go back into Israel, which is the next several verses that we're working through now, 31 through 35. He's going to go back into Israel and persecute the Jews with a fierceness. What's interesting is we see that as a foreshadowing of something that hasn't happened yet. What we're going to find in Revelation chapter 12. We're going to see Lucifer fully deposed. We see Lucifer being cast down. And what's the first thing he targets? He targets the Jews. He targets Jerusalem. He targets the area where the temple is. We're going to see Antiochus do the exact same thing. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices, and place where the abomination of, and place there the abomination of desolation. So now we see him moving from his defeat, going right to the temple, and that's where we saw prophesied in chapter 9 of Daniel, where the abomination of desolation will be placed. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery. Kind of an interesting concept. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, so those who are already breaking those covenant promises or moving against those promises, he's going to corrupt with flattery. It's amazing the concept, when you don't really stand for anything, that you will fall for anything. Not to say that people who have grown, or at least it seems that they have grown, end up just walking completely away from the faith. We have certainly seen that. It seems to be more prevalent all across the news now. This great big spectacle, Not of people who stayed in the faith, which is why I'm glad that so many people looked at the life and the legacy of Ravi Zacharias, because most of what's been flooded with the Christian news network is how many people that were this grand, like theologian, would just completely walk away from the faith. It makes you kind of wonder what it is they stood for, or stood with, from the very beginning. We see these men who are going to fall for flattery already walking away from truth to begin with. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. And there it is. There's the truth of the end times. We really like to think that as believers, it's going to get easier. It's going to be comfy, cozy, and we're going to be nice and warm. That is a huge lie that has caused so many brothers and sisters in churches to stumble and fall. It's not even funny. What is the truth of the end times? Even in the midst of persecution, even in the midst of the storm, those who know God, you will be strong. God's concept of strong, not our concept of strong. That's important. What happens when we put ourselves on a pedestal? We crawl up into an attic and can't get out. That's what happens. God's idea of strong, and carry out great exploits. In context, what does this mean? We're dealing with the Maccabean revolt that happened in the 2nd century. And all the history into that, we'll get into that one later. But for us, in the end times, we see two important things. We know God. We're still going to be carrying out God's mission. What was the key piece there? Knowing God. Therefore, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. I never knew you. It's the relationship. What is it that you can offer God? Absolutely nothing. I know it's a hard word, but he doesn't actually need anything from you. There's nothing you can do that's going to make him scratch his head. It's like, oh my goodness, why didn't I think about that? Old Bobby Joe's the greatest gift I've ever given to humanity. Again, you're going to get stuck in an attic. It's a horrible idea. It's the relationship. One of my favorite memories as a kid, I would help my dad when I was 6 to 9 years old in his auto shop. How useful are you as a 6-year-old in an auto shop? You're not, unless you're a prodigy, which I wasn't. I would help clean tools, organize them, whatever else, but my dad wanted me there with him, just as that relationship piece. We have to know God. We have to be filled, anointed for that work that God has for us. We see the same thing at the baptism of Christ. He didn't start his ministry until we saw that anointing with Jesus. Then he went off and he started his ministry. How do we know God? Being in Word, being in prayer, daily. But a third one, the one that kind of catches us off guard, working with him. What's the best way to know somebody? Work with them. House with them. Bunk with them. Then you start learning things that you kind of wish you hadn't. But it's interesting how tight of a group you form at that point, because you know how he thinks, you know how he acts, you know how he's going to react to a situation. How did the disciples become more like Christ? They spent a whole bunch of time with Jesus. They learned by doing. It's important for us to know God, know his vision, know his mission, so that we can carry out those great exploits. But it's also equally important to understand that there is going to be hard times. Even though these people, these men that knew God were carrying out those great exploits, they suffered a very fierce persecution. In that time, 80,000 Jews were killed. The same number is what was sent into essentially captivity and slavery. Over 100,000. How sharp a figure is that? We need to have that own realization in our lives. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. We see kind of this split. And some of those, understanding, shall fall, to refine them, purifying them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. And we're going to stop there. Because from verse 36 and on, we jump from where he is historically in context into the future. And the reason for that is, it says that, verse 36, this king is going to exalt and magnify himself. Antiochus Epiphanes, historically in the 2nd century, when he defiled the temple, he offered a pig on the altar. Who did he offer that pig to? Zeus, not to himself. So clearly we're not talking about the same king. Last bit of word as we break and as we go from here. I really love verse 32. I really like all the hard things we come across in the Word. How hard is Revelation? There's some terrifying stuff in Revelation. How hard is it through the prophets? There's some horribly terrifying stuff in the prophets. What you always find is hope. Always. As we leave here and we have this heavy word kind of hanging on us, one of the first things we like to do is to go after the sin. When we leave here and we want to share, the first thing we target is the sin. Well, do you know why you're going to hell, Bob? Because of X, Y, and Z. And that's what we focus on. And that's what kind of turns into a judgment. Focus on the hope. Focus on the relationship. What was it that saved you in your life, that brought you to that place of Christ? Was it somebody poking you in the eye? It's because that doesn't save you. The law exposes sin, as we're told all over the place, that the law isn't what saves people, but it's Christ. Quit pointing them at their sin and point them to Jesus. Quit pointing, for the love of everything holy. Stop pointing at the dumpster fire that we're walking around in every day. Point them towards hope. Point them towards Christ. Because what we see and what's on our hearts and in front of us is that there is an appointed time. And we don't know when that is. But I guarantee you, all of us have someone right now on our hearts that we just wish knew Christ. As Paul tells the church in Thessalonica, it's the gospel, the power of the gospel. That's what changed the life. Point them to Jesus, not to the fire. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you so much for the word that you've given to us, God.